After making a rather successful ZX Spectrum port of Midway's Rampage, if you've not seen that video, it might be up on your screen now or most certainly in the description below, Bob Pape needed a well-earned break. Christmas 1987 came and went, and by January 1988, Richard Kiteley was back in touch as Catalyst coders had agreed a 3-game arcade conversion deal with Activision, and they wanted Bob to do the ZX Spectrum port of one of them. All Bob had were the names of these games: a video pinball game called Time Scanner, possibly Championship Sprint, Bob's memory of this game is a little sketchy here, and a scrolling shooter called R-Type. The local Swansea arcade did not feature any of these games, so it was off to London on the National Express to the Electrocoin Test Arcade in Tottenham Court Road and a much more upmarket arcade in Oxford Street. Initial reactions to the games were certainly mixed. Championship Sprint would be an easy choice as it had effectively already been done before with Super Sprint. Time Scanner looked doable, possibly tricky but certainly doable. And then there was R-Type. To Bob it looked like a complete no-hoper, just too much to fit into the home computers. There's too many sprites, colours, play area, movement patterns. There was just so much going on. He distinctly remembers saying at the time, "I pity the poor sod who has to convert that." To say Bob was disappointed when learning he was going to be doing R-Type would be an understatement. David Wainwright, if you remember the boss owner of Catalyst Coders, asked Bob if he could come down to the Southsea office to discuss the game. The small office was in a shared building with another software company called Data Designs. Catalyst's offices were, well, quite frankly, a tip, and having to sometimes sleep there, Bob would sneak into Data Designs' office and get a few hours kip on the hard concrete floor in front of their gas fire. The glamorous world of games programming was still a distant dream as far as Bob was concerned. And so was getting decent money for games made. Bob got $2,500 plus a £100 bonus for finishing Rampage on time, which when talking to other programmers at Catalyst was a fairly low return. David Jolliffe, who was effectively Bob's Commodore 64 twin, doing Rampage and R-Type, was also on the same rate as Bob, so between them they decided they wouldn't get ripped off this time and demand $3,000 from David Wainwright. They teamed up and together demanded the extra £500 for R-Type this time round. Wainwright countered that he was only getting $4,500 from Activision per format, so any extra would come out of his pocket. Bob and Dave stood firm, and Wainwright reluctantly agreed to the pay rise. Wainwright had actually pulled a bit of a fast one, as he was actually getting $7,000 per format from Activision, which, when Bob and Dave both found out sometime later, annoyed them somewhat. Karma is most definitely a thing though, as Payback was certainly going to have its opportunity a few months later. More on that in a bit. Now, of the 3 games, R-Type was certainly the lesser title. Although very much considered a classic today, when it was released it was initially seen as just another side-scrolling shoot-'em-up by a little-known Japanese company called Irem. Although it did have some nice features to it, nobody overly cared about it, hence the Catalyst team having to travel to London just to play it. It didn't even feature highly in Electrocoin's promotional material, and they were the ones distributing it in the UK. If anyone asked Bob what game he was working on, he would tell them R-Type, and more often than not, the reply would be, "R-Type? What's that?" IREM initially stood for International Rental Electronics Machines because as a company, that's what they initially started doing, renting electronic-based leisure items. By the time games like Space Invaders exploded onto the market, the name was officially born really and changed to Innovations in Recreational Electronic Media. Most of their titles were fairly unremarkable, with highlights being Moon Patrol in 1982 and Kung Fu Master, but that all changed in 1987 with 2 titles, Mr. Heli and R-Type. Levels in a futuristic bio-mechanoid appearance, on the surface it looked like any other shooter, slowly scrolling right with a small spaceship to the left with varying aliens trying to shoot and kill you. Starting in a similar vein to games like Konami's Nemesis, whereby you start off with basic weapons which can be upgraded through power-ups as you progress. There was some nice interesting touches added though, the ability to choose your weapon, which could be the difference between making it through a level or not. Another innovation was the Force, a detachable add-on the player could fire off and call back to the front or back of the ship, where it added extra firepower. You also had a wave cannon, a charged up weapon that, with the built-in bar at the bottom of the screen, you could fire it up and take out waves of enemy ships, etc. The 8 levels had varying degrees of difficulty, some not all having end of level bosses to defeat before reaching the end of the game monster in level 8. A tough game to complete, which is amplified by restarting upon being hit with just your basic weapons again. According to Bob's notes at the time, February the 28th, 1988 was the day one for how the flippin' heck am I going to get this behemoth onto the Specky. When they visited the arcade, none of them could get past level 1, which provided some problems, but eventually Catalyst did provide a videotape of someone playing the game with invincibility enabled and thus showing all 8 levels. Bob was relieved to see that the extra levels were quite repetitive, with the first level easily being the longest, purely because this was the level that would attract new players to have a go. Level 2 was big snakes and scorpions, little else. Level 3 was effectively just a big ship. 4 was level 1 with a changed background. Level 5 was more big snakes. 6 was a big maze with big piston things. Level 7 was level 1 again with just more of everything. And in all honesty, level 8 just felt like the game designers had just given up and gone home at that point. Bob could see that if he wrote all the alien routines for levels 1 and 2, he could just reuse them for most of the other levels. All he had to worry about was the big ship on level 3, some of the backgrounds, and the odd unique alien. End of level bosses were something to consider also, but at least they only appeared in 4 of the levels. This gave him a massive boost and certainly changed the mindset from how the hell can I do this to I know that I can. Without being able to reuse much if anything from his Rampage code, Bob's strategy was to start with making a level and sprite editor. There were options already available, but these tended to be coder specific, so it made sense to write something that suited his needs for his game. He also needed someone to do the graphics and turned to Mark A. Jones, who had helped previously on Rampage, so everyone knew him and knew how capable he was. Mark would start by designing the graphics for the 16-bit Atari ST version and then tweak them to work within ZX Spectrum's limitations. This way of working really paid off as the graphics ended up looking pretty incredible. Bob wrote 2 editors that he called Tile D and Ed209, and both did include parts of Melbourne House's commercial drawing package Melbourne Draw for all the character creation and drawing functions. This, although technically cheating, saved Bob valuable setup time, which meant they could start making the game proper that little bit earlier. Having played FTL's Light Force game, Bob knew it was possible to achieve the port of R-Type he wanted on the Spectrum. Sure, he could have opted for a monochrome affair, but he wanted colour, and not at the expense of nasty colour clashing. His game had some advantages over games like Light Force though, in that Bob's sprites never moved on top of any part of the background, so didn't need any masking through big chunky black outlines or colour changing sprites, both of which can be seen in games like Electric Dream's Karnoff here. His eventual answer in getting around any clash issues though all kind of happened by accident, and I have to point out at this stage that a lot of the technical explanations are all Bob's words, as this aspect of game creation confuses the hell out of me. What I do know is that all because Bob couldn't draw for shit, he fixed any colour clashing issues he might have had. He had decided to map and store the game's levels as 4x4 character tiles rather than individual characters. So for example, instead of 32x20 character section of a map taking up 640 bytes, it would take up only 40 bytes. 32 divided by 4 times by 20 divided by 4. Each one of those bytes referring to a tile made up of 16 characters, which of course saves a huge amount of memory. Still with me? Good. With the in-game graphics not yet available from Mark, Bob was writing his routines with dummy tiles, which were basic shapes that even he could muster as a non-artist. Using his rather dodgy drawing skills, even for some triangles and the like, meant he didn't quite fill the tiles right up to the edge. He was just quickly knocking these shapes together and leaving space as they were easier to produce and therefore quicker to use to test. So when put together using a test scroll routine, he was pleasantly surprised to see everything sailing on by without any colour clash in sight. Of course, it was those big spaces between the shapes in the tiles that was the secret to the lack of colour clash, as what happens is if there's always one character empty space buffer between the pixel scrolling characters of a different colour, then there's never any chance of the data from one character picking up the colour attribute from another. And if your characters share the same paper, including the empty buffer characters, and you ditch the idea of the original parallax scrolling against a black background, well, it all works seamlessly. If Bob had had the graphical skills or the proper graphics from Mark at this time without these excess spaces, colours would have bled and Bob may have ventured down the monochrome path after all. So Bob told Mark to go for it with the colours, providing he left one character blank space between characters that had different horizontal colour. As the game didn't move up and down, Mark could do what he wanted with colours vertically. And that's all there really is at the heart of R-Type. The background scrolls 1 pixel at a time, and nearly all the sprites, the ships, aliens, bullets, weapons, etc. move 8 pixels at a time, on character or rather attribute boundaries, with most of the sprites being a coloured ink with a black paper attribute so as to blend in with the usual black game background. The background is really just the black empty space part of things, while the graphics make up the levels. The scenery and solid stuff scrolling on pixels that your ship can crash into is the foreground, with all the game's sprites being sandwiched between the two. Since nothing is supposed to go over the foreground, there's no need for any masking or colour changing of the sprites. When discussing the background, this is actually meant as a combination of both the scenery and black space. All Bob needed to do was prevent the sprites from interfering with the background graphics and find a way of speeding things up, because even at this early stage, everything was running really slowly. Getting these problems sorted was improved somewhat after Bob had spent some time with Activision programmers when finishing Rampage, who were using an Amstrad PCW8256 with a cross-assembler to code their games. At this point, Bob was using a 48K Spectrum, microdrives and a backup copy device that was popular at the time called the Romantic Robots Multiface 1. This was all rather restrictive though, and Bob was keen to learn from the Activision boys about how the Amstrad worked with coding for the Spectrum. Bob spoke to Richard Kitely about getting his own setup, and although his 6128 was a brick for a while whilst he waited for an add-on serial interface, it was all worth it, as now he could assemble on his own Amstrad and send the compiled code directly to the Spectrum via his new cable via the Interface 1.
Or £399 with colour monitor, sir.
Mark was cracking on with the graphics that were tightly optimised for memory as much as possible. In the days before the internet, Mark had to rely on the postal system in getting cassette tapes to Bob with new graphics included for Bob to implement. Implementing them would also require an understanding of the different aliens and their movement patterns. Bob had photocopied a few dozen copies of sheets of paper comprising of lots of rectangle squares. He had the videotape of all the gameplay, would watch an alien appear, pause the tape, make a rough sketch of the background in one of the rectangles and mark where the alien ship was, restart the video and watch it and see where the alien went and mark out its route in the same rectangle. I mean, basically Bob was storyboarding the game in terms of all the different alien entrance and exit screen positions and how many of them there would be when they attacked in sequence. This really worked out for Bob, and seeing the game almost at a frame at a time meant he knew all the small details really well. Eventually Bob had mastered a workable scrolling screen and had everything running at a reasonable pace. There is an incredible detailed section from page 50 in Bob's book that will be linked in the description that goes into great lengths to explain how he achieved both feats. I really can't do it justice here, so please seek that out if you are interested. The alien movement patterns were pretty laborious to get right, but he really wanted everything to look as smooth as it could here on the ZX Spectrum and as close to the arcade original as possible, but of course this took time. Once he had level 1 done, the others should follow pretty quickly, and he could reuse all the major core routines and aliens for the later levels. At the very end of level 1 comes the H.R. Giger-esque alien looking boss with its large tail. It's the one boss alien that really epitomises R-Type. It's on the posters, box art everywhere, so it was imperative that Bob got the Dobkeratops, to give it its proper name, completely right. A sheet of clear acetate worked this time round with neat square grids over the top of it. Moving at 8 pixels at a time, as explained before, means the Spectrum one is certainly more jerky than the original, but this was of course inevitable. But at least with the acetate method, Bob was able to get the tail actions as close as possible, managing to get the tail movement in just 16 frames of animation. By mid-May, and just over 3 months into the project, Level 1 was pretty much done, along with the main player ship, some basic explosions and some collision detection. Level 2 was up next, but an unexpected phone call from a chap called Carl Jeffrey changed the landscape somewhat. Bob had known Carl from his Rampage days, and Carl was working on the Atari ST version of R-Type in his office in Fareham, along with David Jolliffe coding the C64 version. Carl wondered if Bob wanted to join them, especially because they had an R-Type board at the office, so there would be no more squinting at a videotaping. So it really could help get even more detail into Bob's game that he might have missed just using the tape. Plus, Mark Jones didn't live that far away, and Activision was only 15 minutes away, and the Catalyst offices weren't far either. It all seemed a bit of a no-brainer. The Climax Group, headed up by CEO Carl Jeffrey in recent times, was well known for its Silent Hill games amongst many others, but back in 1988 the company was called Images Software and things were somewhat different. Carl's dad was using a shop on the main street selling kitchen units, and Carl had upstairs for Images. The idea was that one of the rooms would be used as a dorm for them to sleep in, but in reality Bob was the only one sleeping there on a regular basis, with Carl staying with his parents and Dave adopting this strange method of literally sleeping kneeling on the floor in the office with his head on his office chair. So there they all were, the Atari ST, C64 and Speccy ports of a game nobody had even heard of, all being worked on and lived in the upstairs room of a kitchen unit shop in Fareham. The hours were long, but more through necessity than anything else. I mean, Bob didn't have anywhere else to be, so worked from 12 to 13 hour days with breaks to stretch legs and reset throughout the day and into the evening. The same applied with the weekends, with occasional trips to London or a Sunday dinner at McDonald's thrown in. A Chinese meal at the end of the week was a highlight, as was visits to the leisure centre and local laundromat for a wash and a clean. Dave had a chap called Jim Smart working with him, and Carl was getting occasional help from a chap called Rob Hylands on the Atari ST version. Bob was pleased that his version was very much on track compared to the others. It was interesting to Bob to see how different the Atari ST coding went once Carl had got his head round some of the differences. He had much more freedom without the 8-bit constraints to just get things done without having to squeeze as much as you can into such a small amount of memory. Dave was cracking on with the C64 version, with, like Bob, most of the first level in place, but he had his own hurdles to overcome. The sprite multiplexer routine he was using just wasn't capable of handling the large amount of sprites necessary for the game. The C64 can only display 8 hardware sprites a frame unless you implement something called a sprite multiplexer to recycle those sprites again on that frame, but it's a very intricate and time critical thing to code. All the more so if you want a lot more than 8 sprites on the screen in any one display frame. Get it wrong and sprites don't just flicker, they vanish altogether. So before he could do anything else, Dave had to completely rewrite his multiplexer and, more importantly, show Activision that the new sprite engine he had was capable of handling everything in the game. They all knew Activision were prepared to accept some differences between the arcade and home computer versions, but more was expected from the C64 version as it was regarded as the better 8-bit offering. The question then became just how many sprites could Dave implement per frame to get away with a game that would satisfy Activision. Bob had started level 2 and getting the snakes that appear at the end of the level to curve smoothly took a large chunk of time. Unfortunately, a trick that enables players to finish the level quickly meant that this hard work was often overlooked. Some of Mark's best work is also apparent on level 2, from the large glass domed backgrounds, brain encased aliens and the giant mollusk boss at the end. After a short time that even involved some visits to the swanky Activision offices, they all got proper PC-based development systems from Catalyst. A state-of-the-art Opus 286 PC with a monochrome monitor running DOS and a professional cross-development package. This setup would allow them to use the PC and via a PDS board, a programmer's development system, which was essentially a parallel I/O card that could connect to the home micro of choice, which was polling the PC waiting for a signal by the custom assembler to send the code to it, and boom, you were up and running in seconds. With a PDS going for 500 quid and a PC at around 1200, Wainwright was certainly chucking money in, which may have been a factor as to why getting paid seemed to be getting more and more delayed for the team. Activision had a team of producers, which were essentially middlemen that would make sure the coders were on track and report as such back to head office. The team would often have to go to Activision's offices to show progress with level demos, but with this being a pain in the arse, they convinced their producer, a chap called Saul Marchese, to come to them, which was easier all round. This also made it easier to trick him on their progress, as they were in control of what they were showing rather than turning up with a cassette tape. One trick they used was to turn up the contrast, colour and brightness controls on their screens with the curtains closed to make the games look as colourful, bright and vibrant as possible. Whilst things at Catalyst continued to get a little more strange, with a mysterious business partner suddenly popping up and following David Wainwright around everywhere, Bob charged ahead to level 3, possibly the one that Activision were the most nervous about, as they paid close attention to Bob's approach, as he was the first to try and crack the big ship. Coming in somewhere at around 392 by 120 pixels in size, it was certainly no mean feat. Moving the ship wasn't the issue. As it took up all the screen estate, it meant very little else was going on, and it didn't move particularly quick either, slowly edging across to crush the player. No, the biggest problem was how on earth he was going to fit two big ships into memory. The original idea was to have one ship looking all pristine and the other one a bit knackered. As the ship got fired upon and gun sprites got destroyed, Bob planned to chop bits of the clean one out and replace them with blocks of the damaged ship. Luckily, when seeing the damaged ship, Bob came to his senses and started with the damaged ship and hid the damaged parts with all the guns, rockets, etc. So when the player blew up a gun, the damaged part was already underneath, but now visible to the player. With the hardest parts considered done, in Bob's mind, it was just a long slog to get everything finished. There were still challenges ahead for the remaining levels and diminishing RAM, meaning going over everything, shrinking, compressing, optimizing everything time and time again to shrink it all down. Even graphics were optimized, pixels removed, or symmetrical sprites chopped in half and then drawn as a mirror image. Pretty much everything that moves is animated in some way, even if it's just flipped, mirrored or colour cycled. It all helps sell the idea that this game was as close to the arcade version as it could be. A chunk of RAM had to be left available for sound and music effects too, which apparently Catalyst were providing through Activision somehow. Quite how that worked financially, Bob wasn't sure. On top of all the level work, plenty of other stuff needed doing too. High score tables, track modes, which ultimately got dropped due to space, multi-load tape routines, joystick and keyboard routines. All in all, these things took so much time. At some point whilst finishing level 3, Bob got a call from Mike Archer, a Portsmouth-based Catalyst employee who Bob had rubbed shoulders with a few times. He was interested in signing up to London-based computer agents Jackie Lyons for a company called Marjac Micros. Bob had heard of them before and decided it was worth a chat at least, which turned out to be a bit of a no-brainer. Just basically do what you're currently doing, but get paid a lot more for doing it. Bob was kind of contracted to Design Maker / Catalyst though, so any deal would have to wait until R-Type was done. This was all a little risky as it would mean returning the dev kits recently obtained, so Bob thought it was best to mull it over and see where things lie after R-Type was completed. Meanwhile, Activision had been busy marketing the game with demos sent to magazines, and Sinclair User even sending someone down to Fareham for a photo shoot. Unfortunately, the article is pretty made up and a stretch on the facts, but hey, any publicity is good publicity, right? Especially so when other software houses were pushing out games very similar to yours, like Rainbow Arts game Katakis. On the face of it, it looked like a Nemesis clone, but once you got deeper into the game, it had R-Type ripoff written all over it. Even the congratulations screen had the same wording, bar one word changed. Activision had a polite word with Rainbow Arts, who, with the threat of legal action, quickly pulled the game from European shelves. Level 5 was done, which meant it was time to circle back to level 4, which had all the fish eggs in it, as Mark called them. Although they become part of the background as more and more of them fill the screen, they don't act like regular background graphics as they can be destroyed. Further complications arise when the eggs can only be destroyed by certain weapons. The bounce laser has no effect on them, and at that point they do act like a regular background object as it bounces off of them. You also had egg eaters who would go around eating the flipping things, so even though Bob felt his code was already a bit of a mess, he had to go back into every major routine and set up all sorts of exception events just to handle this one annoying level. Bob eventually came up with a nice little system of paired eggs pre-shifted by 1, 2, 3, etc. pixels and with partial graphics that would overwrite adjacent eggs. It all worked well, but sadly this routine never saw the light of day. It was July that things started to go horribly wrong. As Bob was working and staying in Fareham, he was barely spending any money, but the same couldn't be said for Dave and Carl, so when the July salary didn't appear, alarm bells were most certainly ringing. After complaining to Wainwright, he eventually dropped the bombshell. There was no more money in the pot, and they weren't going to get paid anymore. It appeared that Wainwright had been using money from future projects to help pay current ones, and this system had spiraled to a point of no return. Advance payments were quickly swallowed up by existing ones, and to be fair, Wainwright was investing money into Catalyst and just seemed to be a victim of bad cash flow management rather than using the money to buy extravagant items the company or he didn't need. And all this really shouldn't have been a surprise to them, in all honesty. A few months earlier, in the March 1988 edition of the Games Machine magazine, there was a piece about how a young games programmers were being exploited and taken advantage of under the headline Industrial Child Abuse by the founder of Automator Software, Mel Croucher, who was speaking to various people in the industry, including his friend David Wainwright, who he'd known for years in the Portsmouth area. What started out as a fairly straightforward opinion piece soon unravelled into something rather extraordinary.
After I went to Matic, I started abusing school children for myself.
I know you've not had any sleep for a few days, but you don't want me to put that in print, do you?
Why not? It's the truth. I think I've ripped off every programmer in Portsmouth, but I've changed now that my business has expanded and, well, I'm ripping them off all over the country. I've got 5 offices nationwide, 30 programmers and a team lawyer. I've learned early on that payments don't lead to good programs. Programmers have to learn from their own mistakes. It's the only way. To get anywhere in software, you've got to get ripped off before you learn anything.
That's a really incredible attitude. Why are you telling me this?
Because it's true. Look, I'm still being exploited today by It's the same with all these big companies. They don't give a toss about programmers. If we've got any food inside us or if our eyesight is short because of permanently staring into monitors about anything. I've been on 4 hours sleep for the past few days now, and they couldn't care less.
Okay, so how do you get out of this situation?
I'm going into publishing on my own, Wicked Software, something like that. Others produce crappy little games and tens of thousands of kids will buy them.
And you are not going to do that. You've learned from your experience.
And now you've got me wrong, Melf. That's exactly what I'm going to do.
Now you might wonder why on earth Bob and others bothered to finish after such articles, but in truth, they wanted just to get the games finished. Finish that thing you started, that thing you are so passionate about, and the same still applied, although running out of money wasn't the same as being ripped off, but it certainly felt like it. Any anger though would soon just turn to a proper jaw on the floor moment when Wainwright expected them to finish the games so he could complete the contract and get the big block of the contractual payment for free. It was Carl who came up with a plan that would maybe help them all: the PC and PDS systems. The cost of these would roughly amount to what they would be owed for the time left to finish the game. This would work perfectly for Bob, as he would then be free of catalysts, ready to join the agents he had previously met up with, all with a dev kit that he wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. The concern was that Wainwright could easily just demand the source code and get one of his cheaper coders to finish the games, and none of them wanted that. They wanted to finish what they'd started. Somehow they needed Wainwright to beg them to stay by keeping the equipment and think that the whole thing was his idea. After he had screwed them over with how much he paid them and how much he was getting from Activision, this was definitely payback time. So Wainwright and Said, his new right-hand man, had agreed to meet them in Fareham to discuss a plan of action. The plan for Bob and team though was as follows. Dave and Carl would be the calm ones negotiating a deal, and Bob would be the angry one who loses it. Lots of shouting and swearing thrown in, only to be calmed down by the other two. At a pre-arranged signal, Bob would storm out and they would run after him to try and get him to calm down. They had a little rehearsal and then they waited for Wainwright to turn up. Wainwright was the one doing all the talking, explaining that they had contractually agreed to finish the game, albeit verbally, and that they would get paid eventually. At this point, Richard Kitely, remember him, helped a bit, as his loose tongue in multiple telephone conversations that he'd had with Bob in the previous months had helped here, encountering anything Wainwright was saying as utter bullshit. Bob took as much of this as it seemed possible to do so before storming out as rehearsed earlier, claiming it was all over, he quit, and he was going back to Swansea. The other two were trying to calm Bob down, acting out the "surely we can come to some sort of deal" before chasing after him. Waiting around the corner, pleased that the plan was going well so far, they returned with the ultimatum that Bob would continue if he agreed to let them keep the dev kits. Bob was like, yeah, I'm only going along with this to keep the others happy vibe, and after this extreme performance by Bob, Wainwright probably couldn't wait to get out of there and agreed to their demands. It later came to light why he readily agreed, but for the time being they had achieved what they'd set out to do. They got Wainwright to sign a short agreement. It was all a little amateur, but that small piece of paper would help them get out of some serious trouble some months later. Things R-Type wise would get a little crazy from here on out. With the deal done, Bob just wanted to get it done, working crazy 16-hour days, frantically getting it finished. Game fatigue was properly setting in. It was just the boring rinse and repeat stuff left to do that was massively demotivating, and what started off as a challenge but quickly became long, boring work. Despite this boredom, some of Bob's favourite work came out of this period, seen here with the flow of yellow butterfly things in level 7, and you can see why. It's rather stunning to see on the little specky. It did mean the poor old Spectrum does slow down a bit, and Bob used to joke with others that it sometimes didn't run in frames per second, but at seconds per frame. This was how it had to be, with everything nailed down so much, compressed, optimised for every pixel, so this port could be as close to the arcade version as humanly possible. Then if there was a little slowdown at times, so be it. I mean, he could have done the game in monochrome, reduced the size of everything down, made other cuts, but he didn't. No one really seemed to mind because the game on the whole looked and played beautifully. As level 7 was ending completion, it was back to the eggs on level 4, as Bob wanted to reuse some of the movement patterns that were on that last level. Straight away though, something was very wrong. The eggs were moving as expected, but if you shot them, they just stayed there like nothing happened. Everything surrounding it in his main code checked out okay, so he checked the code that removed the eggs, and quite simply, it wasn't there. It was gone, vanished. Bob checked all his backups, which went back about 3 weeks back, and nothing. All that careful pre-shifting of character work he had done had somehow vanished. Bob knew what he needed to do to fix it, but this time round it just wasn't working. Maybe because he was coding angry or just stressed out, but it never fully came back to him how he did it the first time round. The patched up code more or less did the same thing, but it's nowhere near as smooth and the detection is just a bit off. Most people don't notice, but Bob certainly does. On top of this disaster, it became apparent that no music was coming Bob's way either from Activision as promised by Wainwright. Either Wainwright was lying or Activision were just pissed off, who knows. But Bob and other versions were to remain very quiet this time. The best Bob could come up with was reusing some of his Rampage sound routines, but luckily Rob Hyland came to the rescue and Bob promised him that somehow he would try and get him 200 quid for him as recompense. They came up with 30 different sounds, including a tune that played when you completed the final level. In-game music was unfortunately out just because there was no room for it. What Rob managed to code in those short weeks was testament to his abilities, and Bob was so grateful for his help. Bob also earned an easy 50 quid at this point for producing a level 1 only demo to be given away with the November C&VG magazine. It was basically making sure the tape code was out and there was nothing left so somebody couldn't hack it into a full version, which had happened to games before. Dave Jolliffe was still struggling with the sprite multiplexer on the C64 version, and annoyingly Bob's pretty much finished Spectrum version was used to beat Dave over the head with a "look what the Spectrum can do, surely the C64 should equal it, if not surpass it," even though it wasn't quite as easy as that. Level 6 was next, which was honestly the longest that Bob had worked on one particular level because of what was involved to make the maze elements and all the sprites moving around with it work together. Rob had finished the sound routines and they slotted in perfectly. Bob had an idea how he would get Rob paid, but not before Wainwright came up with one last ditch attempt to make some more money out of Activision. Wainwright's plan was simple. When Bob finished the game, he was to give the code to him rather than Activision. Activision being where it had been going directly to all this time when new levels were being demoed, etc. So this was not what had been happening up to this point. Wainwright would ask them for more money to hand over the finished game. If Bob refused, Wainwright said he would sue him. A few days later, Activision called chasing when their game was going to be complete and when Bob had any idea he would be delivering it to them. Bob explained as he worked for Catalyst he would be sending them the game and not Activision, and things started to get somewhat spicy. Activision said in no uncertain terms that Bob should deliver the game directly to them, and if he didn't, you guessed it, they would sue him. Now, legally, looking back on it, Activision couldn't touch Bob here. He worked for Catalyst, so it would be Wainwright they'd have to go after. But the question was, did Bob actually work for Catalyst? He didn't have a written contract to produce R-Type, just a verbal agreement and a monthly salary up to a point. When the agreed dev kit note was signed, this was the only real proof that a payment as such was taken in lieu of producing a finished game. But since there was no written contract with Catalyst, and Wainwright had agreed to hand over the dev kit when the game was finished in its current state, the code actually probably belonged to Bob, who could have done anything he liked with it really. He sought advice from Jackie, his would-be agent, and she proposed he give her the code and let Activision and Wainwright fight it out and leave him out of it. Bob didn't want to piss off Activision in case future work came his way, but he didn't really give two shits about Wainwright at this point, and this seemed like the most sensible proposal at this time. So, now the urgency on getting this finished was paramount. Tape load routines and some other fiddly bits done, and it was just the final level to complete, level 8. Being the easiest level with very little aliens and a rather static boss, Bob gave himself the target of one day to finish it. He almost managed it in a 16-hour shift, but tiredness beat him and he finished it with a final game completed message the following day. It was almost done. One last thing was getting Rob his money. He spoke to the producers at Activision and said although the game was pretty much done, he couldn't sign it off because the sound effects and music wasn't his. Rob was happy to sign off the music side of things for a nominal fee of £200, and this would have been nothing to Activision, who agreed to the fee. Bob's last Friday in Fareham was to start like any other, except Richard Kitely called, wanting to speak to Bob in what was one of the nastiest phone calls he had ever had. Kitely was somehow accusing Bob of betraying him and ripping him off and dropping him in the shit when it all went south with Wainwright. And get this, that the code actually belonged to design makers and Bob should give him the code right now. Bob lost it and told Kitely a few home truths and that there was no chance he was getting any code. If he wanted to sue, he'd better get to the back of the queue. He hung up on him before saying anything regrettable and never spoke to Richard again. The next day, Bob was on his way back to Swansea. Back at Swansea and everything else done, just the game credits needed to be written. For some reason Activision wanted these when you loaded the game up, so there is 40 seconds of wait whilst text scrolls that you can't bypass. Nice one, Activision. Bob packaged the code up to hand to Jackie personally at the PCW show at Earl's Court that she was attending, and Bob had the promise of a ticket through Activision, who had just set up in a swanky hotel nearby. It would have been nice to see the other lads at the show, but on talking to Carl it seemed that Dave and Jim were effectively being held hostage at Activision to get the C64 game working. Bob saw this firsthand and was well worried about the pair. They had seemed to get the issue sorted and were now just playing catch up. Activision, being worried that the game was not going to come out in time, actually turned to Rainbow Arts, who they had threatened before with legal action. The game they threatened about, Katakis, was basically reskinned as R-Type alongside Dave's version, and after some time, and having little confidence in Dave's version, they canned it and went for the Rainbow Arts version. All very strange indeed, but it seems everyone's backs were firmly against the wall. Activision also asked Bob about coding the CPC version after finishing the Spectrum one, but he was done by then, which is probably why they took his code and ported it as is to the Amstrad. Not exactly pushing the CPC to its limits sadly, but certainly the easiest solution all round. Bob only spoke to Keith Goodyear over the phone, who did the CPC conversion, but was suitably impressed how he took his car crash code and make it work on the CPC. Keith was given just 20 days to get it done, so it could be released at the same time as the others. Quite an achievement, even though it was a conversion rather than a complete rewrite. With Jackie sorting out handing the game over to Activision, they duly asked Bob to collect a cheque for £500 for finishing the game on time, which was nice, although he had to collect it rather than have it posted. The second time Activision called was to say the tape duplicators were having a problem with copying his tape, as it was loading too fast. Bob asked if they wanted him to rework the loading process, but they said actually they have someone who might be able to sort it, and they would let them handle it and let him know. So R-Type went on sale in November 1988 with very positive reviews from the big ZX Spectrum magazines. Crash magazine gave it 92% and said things like, "This has got to be the arcade conversion of the decade, well, at least the past 3 months. I know I've said that conversions have been good before, but R-Type is mega." Sinclair User gave it 90% and just said, "Possibly the best space shoot-'em-up conversion ever." And Your Sinclair's 9 out of 10 review said, "An unmissable shoot-'em-up, as addictive as Angel Delight and twice as butterscotchy. As faithful a conversion as one could hope for. It's a corker." The game even won a golden joystick at the People's Game Awards, but the first Bob found out about it was seeing Activision's Rob Cousins smiling with award and comedians Hale and Pace. Nice one. Activision argued that the award was theirs as it was their game, which was probably due to the fact that they'd never won one before. Activision did have their own awards, the first and last Activision Awards, which with the free booze got very messy. Cheap awards pissed off devs who had not been given any recognition before, and generally a rather toxic atmosphere unfolded. Bob was out of there as quickly as he could be with his golden framed cassette under his arm. Now, a nice award, the game garnering great reviews, Activision seemingly happy. It would be a nice place to end the story, no? Well, not quite. Firstly, this letter appeared in issue 41 of Your Sinclair. I'm writing this letter in total fury. The game concerned is R-Type. The problem concerns level 8, or rather the lack of it. When you finish level 7 and load in the last level, level 8, you get a replica of level 7 again. And there's more. If you complete this level 7, the game just scrolls on forever. No end of game sequence or message about depleting the Bido Empire. I therefore urge readers not to buy this game, as it is a rip-off. Jay Parker from Norwich in Norfolk. Well, we all know Bob most definitely did a level 8, so what the hell happened to it? Well, it wasn't there. The header block for level 8 was right, but sure enough, level 8 was most certainly level 7 again. This was indeed odd. Bob knew it wasn't him, but triple checked everything he had passed on and confirmed it most certainly was him. It couldn't have been the tape duplicators either, as it was a straight copy of level 7 again. The second level 7 had a level 8 header. So who else then? Well, if you remember, Activision had problems with the loader upon making tapes, told Bob about it, and then went to someone else. And that someone else was Mr. Speedlock himself, David Aubrey Jones. Speedlock was a commercial method of copyright protection created by David Looker and David Aubrey Jones and marketed by Speedlock Associates that relied on various methods of encryption and non-standard tape loading to produce games that made tape-to-tape copying difficult. Bob once saw most of the technique in creating Speedlock games, and he thought it would have been something less back bedroom businessy than it actually was on seeing it, and he did question in this instance its way of encrypting the data did cause the problem. But in the end, no heat came Bob's way, so Activision must have known the problem lied elsewhere, and they offered a replacement updated copy of the game, so where did they get that from if it was Bob's fault, to anyone who complained. Who, quite honestly, wasn't that many, as it was tough to get through the game anyways. Other versions of the game did okay too. Carl's ST version was even part of a power pack bundled with the Atari ST itself, which was nice. And the Commodore 64 version was, not as good as it could have been. Rainbow Arts version seemed, lazy, even hastily put together compared to Dave's one. The rotating alien wheel on level 1 doesn't rotate. The level 3 big ship is missing 90% of its guns. There's no boss alien at the end of level 5. The pistons that move around level 6 look more like cabbages, and so on. Manfred Trentz of Rainbow Arts has said that they only had 7 weeks to do the job, and it's by no means a bad conversion. It just looks more colourful and plays a bit faster compared to the unreleased version, but at times you can see the limitations imposed on it by its short deadline. And finally, there was one more you couldn't make it up piece of drama to the R-Type roller coaster. A call to Bob from good old HMRC. They were asking why he had made no national insurance contributions since 1987. And it got worse when he also got a call from Inland Revenue for very similar questions. Design makers, although appearing to make deductions from their salaries for tax purposes, didn't actually pass those deductions on. This was the case for other employees too, and it was up to them to prove they thought that they were paying their tax. Luckily, Bob had enough payslips, and even that short note explaining the PC dev kit was part payment for services, which he did unfortunately have to pay some tax on to prove his innocence, and the tax office agreed that Bob and colleagues were innocent parties in this fiasco, and thankfully let them off. Surely that was that, apart from being contacted by an officer from the Neath Port Talbot fraud squad who wanted to interview Bob with regard to certain irregularities concerning the funding Design Maker had received from the Welsh Development Agency. Bob was spoken to at home by 2 police officers and told them all he could remember of Kitely, Wainwright and the 18 months or so he had spent working for them. And that was the final chapter in Bob's involvement with R-Type for the ZX Spectrum. Honest.
Anything to drink?
What's that?
Just cider.
This isn't just cider. Fraud squad, hold it, sister.
Bob now says in his book that playing some of his old games again is quite disconcerting, as it's like looking at someone else's work. He just can't recall ever coding them or how. But R-Type is like visiting an old friend and sharing the good times they had together. Of the 17 or so games that he wrote in his career as a games programmer, he never enjoyed himself more than when he worked on this version of R-Type, and he missed the time he spent in Fareham with Carl, Dave, Jim and Mark. What a ride, and what a game, and I can't say it enough. If you enjoyed this roller coaster ride, please do check out Bob's book. It's free to read and goes into so much more depth than I could cover here. Links are in the description, and I'd like to thank Bob for allowing me to do this video. He was super chilled about me using his book and really helpful in plugging some gaps. So thanks Bob, and thanks to you for making it this far, and thank you for watching. I'd like to thank my members here too, who for just 99p a month get access to videos early and now even ad-free. Credits in the video, as you can see below, some cool emojis and member-only posts. I'm also trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, so if you haven't subbed already, please do. It helps me reach out and get more eyes on the channel, and of course, it's completely free. So that just leaves me to say, thanks for watching, and I will see you all on the next one. Bye for now.